Hi everyone! I've wanted to make this video for a couple of years now, but it always seemed like the wrong time and I felt it may not be appropriate. However, I gave it another thought and today I'd like to talk about Russians living in the UK. For years, Russians have appeared in the UK news under quite shocking circumstances that have affected people's lives. I understand this can create mixed feelings, especially for those who haven't personally interacted with representatives of this culture. And if you have ever wondered why your Russian colleague sounds abrupt or what the actual numbers are, this video is for you. So, who are the Russians living in the UK? How many reside here? And how and why are they coming to the UK? What are the cultural differences? I'll cover who's actually here, why the numbers might surprise you, and most importantly, what language thing that causes so many misunderstandings in everyday interactions. By no means am I a historian or an anthropologist, so I'd like to share my perspective based on genuine research and my personal observations within a naturally limited information bubble. And before we dive into the numbers, there is a small but important confusion around the word Russian itself. Let's start with the term Russian, which can be confusing because there is only one term in the English language, but it can mean two different things, not always linked words. Russian as a nationality and Russian as ethnicity. This often leads to misunderstanding on both sides. There are dozens of ethnic groups living in Russia, and some of them could be actually offended if they are called Russian as an ethnic group. On the other hand, Russian propaganda, when highlighting any public speech where words Russia and Russians are being used, can twist it to highlight potential racism and hatred towards people rather than political cause. Now to migration. The first significant wave of modern migration from Russia to the UK began in the early 1990s, 2000s, less than 35 years ago, making the Russian community one of the youngest in the UK. As of 2021, the Russian population in the UK was recorded as 58,000, less than 0.1% of the UK total population and under 0.5% of Moscow's population, for comparison. Like other migrants, Russians come to the UK through available immigration routes. The majority arrive through work and talent visas, suggesting that a good portion of this cohort may decide to reside in the UK indefinitely. This group consists of some of the brightest minds the UK has attracted from Russia, contributing value to the economy. Those coming through the working visa route don't have access to public funds, meaning they don't get benefits and actually pay a surcharge for using the NHS, thus not putting pressure on the social welfare system. Getting a work visa is a complex process, so it's fair to assume that those who make it here are motivated, skilled, and keen to prove their value. Another group coming to the UK includes dependents of primary visa holders. This group has broader occupational opportunities. However, being a dependent in a family of a hard-working individual can be quite isolating if they do not immerse themselves in the British community. Language barriers can contribute to their isolation within the Russian-speaking community, which is several 100,000 strong in the UK. The majority of migrants from post-Soviet Union countries still speak Russian for historical reasons. Students coming to the UK generally represent very wealthy families, able to afford their children's education, or incredibly bright and talented youngsters who have received grants, for example, to join university here. Not all of them strengthen ties with the UK after graduation, so naturally part of this cohort returns to Russia. A tiny percentage of the Russian population in the UK, perhaps the most noticeable though, comprises wealthy individuals. This group includes public figures, while some of them prefer to stay away from the public eye. As you might be aware from public sources, some of these wealthy individuals may sometimes have a controversial background and questionable sources of funds. However, there are dozens of reputable experts in exile now, which gives access to bright, independent minds who can shed light on many topics. There are enough reputable public speakers and experts who are able to provide informative opinions on various topics, including politics. Surprisingly, given the level of coverage of current geopolitical activities, I don't see many reputable Russian experts from the UK or Europe contributing to the expert position and providing insights to the UK audience. This leads to an incredible gap in understanding of the actual political situation in Russia and contributes to incomplete and sometimes even ridiculous analytical statements. It is getting better now, but still far from the reality sometimes. Some of those who moved past their visa attachment to a specific occupation may be interested in developing their businesses. There are over 500 Russian-speaking businesses in the UK. This does not necessarily mean that all of them are run by Russians, but some are. For example, there are dozens of restaurants offering Russian or Eastern European cuisine, with the most famous Russian restaurant being Marya Ivановna in Knightsbridge, which is my personal number one choice for Russian cuisine and experience. The most expensive and luxurious experience can be offered by Bob Ricard restaurant, where you can try a modern interpretation of classic Russian cuisine. The number of Russian schools is increasing each year to meet the growing demand. There are dozens of Russian schools in the UK. Russian-style beauty services are in high demand, and unfortunately, businesses of this type are not well established to meet these demands. This is due to the nature of the business and profitability not fitting well into the most obvious relocation models. Since 2021, many businesses have removed references to being able to provide services in the Russian language, which is understandable under the circumstances. There is no such thing as the typical Russian. Every person is different. The reasons why integration fails are common across migrant communities. Cultural and language differences, lack of support, and being a migrant from the first wave make it very difficult. And not every relocation ends up with proper integration into the new environment. And language is one of the most important barriers that, like many other immigrants, Russians face. But I'm not talking about grammar and vocabulary in this particular case. I'm talking about the perception of Russian speakers. You may have heard that Russians come across as direct or abrupt, and you have perhaps also heard that it's because of the culture. Well, it is not the main reason. The main reason is the fundamental language structure differences. This is where the real communication gap starts. Please let me explain that. The English language is analytic, while Russian is synthetic. In analytic languages, relationships between words are expressed using function words, prepositions, articles, auxiliary verbs, and intonation. In synthetic languages, like Russian, these relationships are expressed by changing the form of words, including through prefixes and endings. For example, the sentence, "She has brushed her hair," in Russian can be expressed in just one word, conveying the subject of the conversation, its gender, number, and tense, just one word instead of 5, just by changing the prefix and ending of the word to brush. The same principle applies to intonation. Although intonation is also important in Russian, it plays a much lesser role compared to English. In Russian, changing the form of a word can indicate intention and politeness. In English, however, conveying this nuance is simply not possible in the same way. Therefore, all shades of politeness are expressed through polite words, intonation, and the absence of imperative moods. For example, to invite someone to sit down politely in English, a speaker may use the phrase, "Would you like to sit down, please?" ensuring the right intonation is chosen. In contrast, in Russian, this can be conveyed with just the specific form of the word sit. The form of this word alone indicates politeness and an invitation rather than a command. And the intonation chosen does not significantly alter this meaning. Hence, if a Russian speaker cannot reproduce the nuances of English speech, even the most polite sentence can sound extremely direct, and the speaker might not even realize it. This does not mean that now, understanding the reason, you should tolerate expressions that sound rude to you. Migrants have a responsibility to learn the local language to an extent that locals can understand. But if you are able and willing to pause just for a moment to consider whether an offense or command was never intended, and it's just the limit of your counterpart's abilities to express themselves in English, then I'm sure you can make a difference to this person. And that's all I wanted to share today. Just a small window into how culture and language shape our daily interactions. If this gave you a different perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, whether you're British or Russian or from anywhere else, really. Thank you for watching.